So ultimately, I wrote a book, I guess about 5, 6 years ago, called A Caller's Game. When I sent it to my agent, I told her, listen, I'm going to retain English rights for myself. You can go ahead and sell to all my foreign publishers. I'm okay with that, but I'm going to put it out in English on my own. And at that point, I'd been in about 150 different countries, about 25 languages or so. So there was still a decent sized market out there for her. But I wanted to see what would happen if I tried that, what I call the hybrid approach. So I had my own independent press, which I'd already incorporated back with the first book, and I put it out through that. And I really liked that because I got the financial benefits of putting it out as an indie, but I still had all the foreign publishers putting it out in all these other places. It was kind of the perfect mix of things. But there was always this one little problem. Like there's certain places you can't get into as an indie. You can get into bookstores, but it's very, very difficult to do. Airports are near impossible. Places like Costco and Target, and Walmart, that's like the holy grail, but you can't really do it as an indie author.
Hello, and welcome to Most Writers Are Fans, the podcast that explores the intersection between writing and fandom. My name is Terry Bartley, and I'm your host. So today's episode is pretty exciting. I'm joined by the suspense author J.D. Barker. I was contacted by his publicist sort of randomly, and then it was sort of a joy to sort of get into who he is and his whole deal. He's a really cool guy, a really successful author. It was really fun to sort of learn from him and kind of see what his journey has been like. So stay tuned for that. It's a really good interview. So for today's intro, I want to talk about something a little potentially controversial in the author space, but also a little bit about just sort of give it a trial and error. So I want to talk about AI in writing. So I'm a high school English teacher, and to say that tools like ChatGPT is the bane of my existence is frankly an understatement. It is the worst thing in the world. Kids don't want to write truly anything. I'll say could you free write something? I won't even grade the grammar or spelling, just sort of write for 2 sentences, and they'll go into ChatGPT and be like, hey, could you write 2 sentences for you? And it's could you use your brain a little bit, please? Just a little bit of using your brain. And it's sort of endless. And so the way that I usually, so often I usually know, right? Usually I know whenever it's AI because it's sort of obvious that it's not written quite as thoroughly, or it's not as thought out or really thought out at all, or it's sort of not really answering the questions, we're talking around it, which all of those are things that high school answers can be, but you can usually tell the difference between if they actually thought and if they didn't. And so usually whenever I can tell, I have to find some way to say I've proven it. So I usually run it through a bunch of AI checkers and try to find some evidence. And then sometimes one of the easiest ways is to just put the prompt from the question straight up into ChatGPT and see what it writes. And sometimes it writes practically the identical thing as what they turned in. And then it's cool, this feels like enough evidence to me, because it's basically, plagiarism, because it's not even subtle. It's just straight up the words that they found in ChatGPT. So, obviously this is in the writer space is a bit controversial because there's people wanting to write full books with this, which seems fully crazy because it's not good enough to do that. And I've really been wondering what is the use of this tool? Because that's what I've long thought, is that we've sort of framed the conversation of AI in a way that is sort of blows it out of proportion. I don't think the purpose of this tool is to replace us creative thinkers. I think the purpose of it is for us to use it as a tool. The same way we'd use Microsoft Word or Scrivener or any of these other writing tools to sort of help us move through our stories and navigate them in interesting ways. And so the other day I pasted in, we're reading the Blue Beetle graphic novel, the original graphic novel, This Land Is Our Land, a Blue Beetle story, in my graphic novels as literature class. It's a really great read. And if you want to check it out, do that. But I asked the kids a essay question about it, and then I pasted it into ChatGPT just to see if it was identical to anything that they put. And it was whatever. That's not the point of this conversation. But at the end of it, it asked me a question. So it had the answer that was sort of here's what this is. And then it said, would you say that this mix of realism and fantasy enhances your enjoyment of superhero stories? Which is a super vague and not helpful question, right? But if you think of it as a writing prompt, it's not bad. So I just sort of decided to take it up on it and just kind of see where it brought me. And so I did. And I had a really interesting conversation, essentially, with ChatGPT, where I was sort of asking it about my concerns with the book, because it does have some sort of really overt political messaging. And so I asked it about that, which sort of led into a conversation about how honestly, like, it's just sort of frustrating that DC doesn't have more Latinx characters that are like starring in their own series or their own graphic novels, whatever. And it just sort of like is this void that exists in DC where there's like characters like Jaime and Renee Montoya in Justice League currently, but it's just like a real void of those characters. So we sort of kept going, and we led to this sort of like idea, like almost like this pitch of this comic with like a team led by, not led by, like an entirely Latinx team of heroes. And like it gave me like some obvious ones that I'd mentioned. Like I mentioned Renee Montoya, I mentioned Jaime, I mentioned, a couple others. And then I said, like, do you have any idea? Like, are there any that I haven't mentioned? Because I knew that there was, but like, like sometimes you don't think off the top of your head. And so like it gave me a full list of like some, and like again, this list wasn't great. Like one of the characters that told me was Dr. Fate, which is Khalid, the new one, who is not Latinx. He is Middle Eastern, and it even acknowledges that. But it's like that's not what I asked you for. Why did you even give me that? But whatever. It maybe also might be a demonstration of how there's not that many Latinx characters in DC. But it really like led me to build a team, like because it gave me like ideas of other people that I haven't thought of, and it really led to like putting a sort of like a cool like proto Teen Titans, basically led by Fire of Justice League International. And let me see if I could find the full team. It was so it was Yara Nall, who is the New Wonder Girl. She's sort of been in comics a little bit. She's not been She's not been utilized very well, but she's out there. Jaime, Bunker, and then Yolanda Montez, who is Wildcat, the Legacy Wildcat. She was in the Stargirl show, if you guys are familiar. And then led by Fire as kind of like a mentor role. And I was like, that's actually a really cool team. And it really led me to sort of like talking a little bit about like the different ways that Yara specifically has kind of like, she's this really interesting character that they developed, but then they've just not done enough with her to really explore those elements. And it was just a really cool like tool to be like, hey, this would actually be a really good comic. I've sort of like got some story beats here. And like I would never pitch a comic with a full Latinx team to DC. That is not a book that should be written by me. That is a book that should be written by a Latinx author. But there were like some pure storylines that I sort of suggested in here that I could sort of like write too. So maybe it's like a thing I could co-write or something. So, maybe I should give a call up to Josh Trujillo, the Blue Beetle writer that I interviewed on this podcast, to see if he'd be up for doing a Teen Titans, a Latinx team that I've sort of tossed together, make a pitch for that. But like, again, it's not a thing that I would pitch, but like, it is an interesting idea. And I kind of wonder if you could use a tool like this to kind of like help you work through your own story beats. Because again, like it's not writing. I'm the one writing. It's basically just giving me prompts that I then like basically write to. And I never really thought of ChatGPT as that because like we think of us writing prompts into it. We don't think of it giving us prompts. But it was basically giving me prompts through sort of like this pseudo conversation. And I just sort of thought like what an interesting way to use this tool. And maybe like this is the way it should be used and not just like, could you please write a full chapter of a book for me? Because like that's not going to be good. But like you could use this in a way that if I then go on to write like this comic myself, it probably would be a lot better than if I tried to have ChatGPT write a comic because it just wouldn't be very good if it wrote it. I often feel like the real problem with ChatGPT and these other AI tools, like these writing model AIs, is that we sort of misrepresent them whenever we talk about the fear surrounding them. And I just feel like if we could figure out a way to think of them more as tools and not as like writing replacements. And I mean, there's a long way to go. Like I've got a long way to go to get my students to realize that they can't just put their essay questions into this and get the answers, because then they're not thinking for themselves. They're not getting the thing I wanted them to get out of the essay question in the first place. I want them to think for themselves. That's the whole point of it, right? So like there's a long way to go to get like society to understand this. But I do feel like after sort of this experience that there are ways to use this that aren't destructive, that are actually just sort of like helpful and help us kind of like create bounce ideas off of people and find ways to, because sometimes you don't always have a collaborator that you can work with in a way that is like this sort of like immediate. So like it's just kind of cool to have some people like talk about an idea with. So, just want to throw that out there. Like, I'd love to hear if other authors have experience with AI that's productive and not destructive. Feel free to shoot me an email, press at starlightkingpress.com. I'd love to sort of have a chat about that. I think it'd be a fun thing to sort of delve into. But yeah, so just stick around. My interview with JD Barker is coming up. Like I said, it's a really good one. So stick around for that. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ghostwriter fans. I'm joined now by suspense author JD Barker. Thanks so much for joining me, JD.
Hey, Terry, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
So tell me a bit about you and what you do and all those things.
Well, I get paid to make stuff up. I guess is probably the easiest way to sum it up. I spent 20 years working in the corporate world, and I used to come home at night and write and sort of dream of becoming a writer. And I worked primarily as on the side as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
Yeah.
But I sort of like became a side gig for me. So I was working in the corporate world, and I would come home at night and basically work on other people's books. Did that for a little over 2 decades, and over that time, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list, all with other people's names on the cover, which gets really old after a while. My wife pulled me aside after that 6th one and said, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's find a way to make that happen. And she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned in Florida, the house, cars, boat, literally every possession that we had. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side, and then lived in the other side and used the rent from our tenants to kind of pay our bills. And then we sat down at the kitchen table one day. We looked at the bank statement, and she said, okay, looks like you got about 18 months to make it as a writer. Go. And, I just kind of hit the ground running, and nothing like putting your feet to the coals to really, get something to happen.
Yeah, I love that. Honestly, like that's so wild to hear because, like as authors, like we always aspire to be like New York Times bestseller, right? Like that's like always like the like ultimate goal. So it's wild to think about hitting it, but also like knowing that it's not perceived publicly as your achievement. Like what was that like to kind of like see to have achieved the thing, but then to have also like not had your name on it?
Yeah, that was it was tough. Like I did a lot of different projects. I wrote a lot of memoirs for politicians and sports figures. That was a little bit different. Autobiographies for other people because I knew, their name was going to be on the cover from the get go. It was a story about their life or something that had happened to them. So that, wasn't that big of a deal. But the fiction stuff, that really stung. Especially when I, writing, like there was one New York Times bestseller. He got about halfway through his book and he came up on his deadline. And he had to leave for a book tour, so he didn't have time to finish it. So I worked directly with the publisher. They sent me the outline for the second half of the book, and I wrote it for him. Like that was, strictly, thoughts coming out of my head. And, like that was like my real first taste of fiction. Then I ended up doing a couple other ones and I really liked it. But like those books in my mind were, 100% creations of my own. Once I got beyond the outline of that first one, I was literally, like coming up with the stories and everything. And it just, it just didn't feel right. But at the same time, it was a great learning curve. I really learned what the folks in New York were looking for because I was working directly with the publishers and editors.
Yeah, it is also it is sort of cool to think about because you always hear people say things like don't publish your first novel because like it's never going to be good enough. But you've had plenty of novels before you got to your actual first novel, which is probably kind of nice that the thing that you made with your name on it was like sort of the culmination of all the things you'd written over the years, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I was kind of a hired gun. So like a publisher would pick up a book that they really liked, but it needed a lot of work, and they would go back to that author and they would tell them, like, you need to cut 20,000 words out of here. You need to combine these characters. You need to do this. You need to do that. And a lot of times with new authors, they just can't do that. But because I was coming in, strictly as somebody willing to put that book on the chopping block, it was a very different scenario, and they were very candid with me about what they needed. They would tell me this author can't write dialogue to save their life. The pacing is terrible. This needs to go. That needs to go. They didn't sugarcoat anything, and I think that's what really gave me an education in this. I really learned what they wanted.
Yeah, and I feel like probably a lot of authors listening to this are sort of like interested in the idea of like the book doctor ghostwriter work because like it's sort of like a day job that is writing that's not your writing, right? So they're probably wondering like what was that process like? Was that like was it similar to being a published author where you're just sending your stuff to agents and agents pick you up and then find you those gigs, or like what did that look like for you?
No, I actually found the very first one. I'd been working for newspapers and magazines. I had started doing that back in college, so I already knew a lot of people, because they kind of moved on from those jobs to working in the publishing industry, or as the years went by. So I knew a lot of people on that front. But the very first memoir I did was for a sports figure. There's an NDA there, so I can't really go into too much
Yeah, yeah,
detail.
yeah.
But I was in South Florida. I was at a Miami Dolphins game. And I basically just approached a football player that was very well known, and we were talking, and I asked him, have you ever considered writing a book? And he told me that he gets approached for that all the time, but he doesn't have the time or the skill to put a book down on paper. And that's essentially where it was born. And ultimately his agent went to the publishers, got him a very big advance for a book that he hadn't written yet. And then I sat down with him, and I wrote that book, and that's essentially where it started. And I encourage new authors to do that kind of thing all the time, because first of all, it was a fantastic payday. You're not going to, the money that I received on that was insane compared to what most debut authors are getting for fiction work in today's world. But it also gave me a lot of insight into storytelling, because when you write a memoir, you're in that person's head. And it's no different than a character. So you have to write it in their voice. You're using their language. A lot of, we recorded a lot of conversations and interviews between each other. So I transcribed those and then used that. But it really gave me a really solid handle on dialogue and just inner voice for a character. And the more I did that, the easier it became for me to craft fiction characters, because I basically used that same framework. The real people that I had worked with became my fiction characters. So it taught me how to do quite a bit.
Yeah, it's really compelling because, like to be a to make a memoir good, you have to take the real life experiences but then sort of like craft a story around it, right? Because like they have a story, but it's not always like life isn't laid out as a story, right? So you sort of have to like make those beats in a way, or like connect those beats in a way that makes sense and makes it interesting for people. So that's kind of cool to sort of like explore storytelling through that way, because I think, like I started out in journalism, and I do think that journalism is sort of like where you learn to really tell stories, because you have to
Mhm.
sort of like learn what real life stories are, which then make your fiction stories look more like real life, which is, I think makes them a lot stronger.
Yeah, I mean, back in the newspaper days, your editor would tell you, okay, you've got 350 words on the side. You need to sum up this 4-month event, in 350 words. So it taught you to be concise. Writing memoirs too. I mean, I learned quite a bit on the editing front, because when you sit down with somebody and they're meant to tell you their life story or their life to date, they have always got stories in mind that they feel should be in that book. And one of the things I learned very quickly is those stories are the ones that really don't necessarily need to be there. Like they're not that good. They're compelling to that individual, but not to somebody who's picking up a book, as an outsider. So you really have to get them to open up and start telling you things that they wouldn't normally tell, because they try to paint themselves into this, in a perfect light. They want to come across as a particular person, a particular character. They want other people to see them a certain way. But when people do that, it's not authentic. So you have to sit down with them. You have to get them talking. Then you have to get them to kind of open, a couple cabinet doors they may not want to, and start telling you about things that they may not want to discuss. Once you start getting into that, then you get to the real gold of what can become a decent memoir. Ultimately, I put it all down on paper, because they would always insist that some of those other stories need to be in there, even though I knew at the time that they weren't going to make the final cut. And seeing it laid out, their stories versus the ones that I really had to push them to give. You can kind of tell them, like this can go, like this isn't quite as important. This right here is really compelling. This is what people are going to want to read. And it's no different than crafting a fiction book. Like when I write a novel, a lot of times they go very long. I'll write 140, 160,000 words, and then I'll take 60,000 words out on the back end. And to me, it's almost like cutting or cooking a good piece of steak. You trim the fat away. That's very much what I do. I just take pass after pass after pass, and if something just doesn't feel like it needs to be there, it's gone. I learned that writing memoirs.
Yeah, and what you're describing to do with your subject is really not dissimilar to what you do in a fiction novel, which is sort of like pulling those things out of your characters, right? It sounds crazy to people that aren't writers, but like that's what you do with your characters, is you sort of like have to get to know them and find their stories and find the things about them that make your book unique and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, characters to me drive every project that I do. I always come up with the characters and I fully develop them. Like I've got a serial killer series set in Chicago called The Fourth Monkey. My lead detective is a guy named Sam Porter, and like I could take Sam and drop him at the mouth of Disney World, and I could tell you what ride he's going to go on first, where he's going to eat lunch, what he's going to do. Pretty much for the entire day. None of this stuff would ever make a book, but it's because I know him just as well as I know my best friend. And like for me, like I need to know my characters that well. And once I have them developed to that point, I can take them and I can drop them in some crazy scenario, which essentially is my plot. And chocolate and peanut butter kind of mixed together, and it works. But like I've never been able to go the other direction. I've never been able to start a book strictly with plot and then develop my characters based on plot. To me, that just doesn't feel right. The characters don't come across as authentic. It's better to just take a real life person, in your head anyway, a real life person, and drop them into some kind of crazy scenario. And if you know them, the reactions and everything are genuine, and the readers relate to that.
Well, and two, I think what's I'm editing a book right now, and I've sort of realized as I'm editing it that like my world building maybe wasn't as robust as it maybe should have been, because there's like things that don't make sense when I start to actually think about it as a person, and I think that that's one of
Right.
those things that if you do that early on, like if you get your characters tight early on and figure out what makes sense, then it will make a better book in the end, because like a lot of times the truth is whenever you write a book, like you have your main characters who are pretty fleshed out, but then like a lot of other people exist in the story solely to serve those people's stories, right? And sometimes you don't flesh out them enough, even if they may have connections to your characters that might matter if you did flesh them out more.
Well, but the thing is, you're able to recognize that, like you can
Yeah.
you can see it, and that's extremely important. That's probably one of the most important skills when it comes to editing. A lot of people will write right through that and they don't see it. They'll finish up that book and they'll turn it into their agent or their editor, and not think twice about it. But for me, it's the same thing. Like it's almost like I'm driving down a road and I take a wrong turn. Like you can kind of keep going and hope that road is going to eventually connect with the where you need to go, or sooner or later you get a little too far off into the weeds and you have to throw the car in reverse and go back. Like you learn to recognize that kind of thing, I think, as you're writing. It just doesn't feel right, and you have to backpedal and fix it. But like I'll usually write through those, like even if I know that they're there, I'll keep going and keep going. I've got a list. Usually I use Scrivener to write everything, and my very first tab on Scrivener is things I need to change on the next pass. So when I feel like one of those things jumps out at me and it didn't work, I'll just make a quick note of it and fix it the next time I go around. But I found that a lot of times, when I do go off in the weeds like that, sometimes that's where the gold is. So you kind of have to
Yeah.
follow that thread and see where it goes. It either plays out or it doesn't.
Did you have an agent already at that point? Like, did people know that you had done any of these things, or was it fully like you were sort of doing
I,
it off
I
the record, quote unquote?
Yeah, a lot of it, I was a hired gun by mainly publishers. I worked with a few agents. Sometimes an agent would pick up a book that they really liked, and the editors would pass on it, for the same reasons I had mentioned before. So I would work with the agent and that particular author to fine tune the text, to get it to the point where a publisher would take it. So I had a lot of agents that I knew, but I didn't have one myself. I wrote the book, and I finished it up, and honestly, like I had never queried an agent before. I didn't understand the process. I didn't bother to research it the way that I should have. Instead, I did probably what nobody should do. I went out and bought a list of agents, a mailing list, and I sent them all literally a form letter. To whom it may concern, this is what the book is about. This is who I am. And I sent it all off. I didn't look at any of their websites. Every agent, if you look, they've all got their own little requirements. They
Yeah.
want to see the first chapter. They want to see 3 chapters. They want a PDF. They want a Word document. Got to be Times New Roman. It's got to be Arial. Like they've all got their own little requirements. I ignored all of that. I just sent them all the exact same thing. And surprise, I didn't get a whole lot of response from it. But I didn't know what I had done wrong. Because I hadn't researched it. So ultimately, I decided I would self-publish the book. But I also made a conscious decision that if I were going to do that, it would have to be on par with something coming out of one of the big 5 publishers. It had to look like something out of Random House. I couldn't just hit that publish button on Amazon and walk away. So I hired the best editors, cover designers, formatters, across the board. Ultimately, put it out as a hardcover, a paperback, and an audiobook, all on the same day. Just kind of followed the same model that I saw, with Penguin Random House books. I got really lucky with that. Stephen King helped me out with part of it. He let me use some of his characters in the story, which was huge. The press got wind of that, and when the stories hit up in the press about it, libraries discovered the book, bookstores discovered it, and that really ignited sales. And I ended up moving a lot of copies, enough to the point that when I wrote my next book, which was The Fourth Monkey, I had no trouble getting an agent. I queried 53 of them. That time I did it the way I was, you're supposed to. I actually looked at their requirements and sent everything off, following their guidelines. I ended up with like 13 or 14 offers within a couple of weeks, and then ended up signing with an agent out in Colorado.
So, as somebody that has done self pub and trad pub, what do you see the differences as, and what do you like? Do you feel like it was worth the transition to like take the work off of your plate, to go trad, or
It really depends on the person. So I'm a major control freak. And when you indie publish a title, you get to, basically handle every single aspect of it. And I like that. I like handling every part of the book publication. With The Fourth Monkey, that one sold for a 7-figure advance. I had a movie deal and a TV show attached to it. So it was the complete opposite.
yeah?
You send off your book, you work with an editor, and then from there, it's completely out of your hands. They can change the title, they can change whatever they want. And I had a couple books that I published in a row that were traditionally published after Fourth Monk or after Forsaken, my first book. So I got a real taste for that. But what I noticed is, I paid real close attention to the economic side of it. As an indie author, you get roughly 70 cents on the dollar, and in the traditional world, you may get a big check as an advance, but it's an advance. You've got to pay it back, and you're paying it back in small little increments. You're lucky if you're getting 15 to 20 cents on the dollar. So it takes a lot of time to pay that back. So ultimately, I wrote a book, I guess about 5-6 years ago, called A Caller's Game. When I sent it to my agent, I told her, listen, I'm going to retain English rights for myself. You can go ahead and sell to all my foreign publishers. I'm okay with that, but I'm going to put it out in English on my own. And at that point, I had been in about 150 different countries, about 25 languages or so. So there was still a decent sized market out there for her. But I wanted to see what would happen if I tried that, what I call the hybrid approach. So I had my own independent press, which I'd already incorporated back with the first book, and I put it out through that. And I really liked that because, I got the financial benefits of putting it out as an indie, but, I still had all the foreign publishers putting it out in all these other places. It was kind of the perfect mix of things. But, there was always this one little problem. Like, there's certain places you can't get into as an indie. You can get into bookstores, but it's very, very difficult to do. Airports are near impossible. Places like Costco and Target and Walmart, that's like the holy grail, but you can't really do it as an indie author. I sent it off to my agent. He started shopping it to all the traditional publishers. We got a film offer, and it got optioned pretty quickly. And it looked like it was going to go to auction with the traditional publishers, meaning there were several that wanted the book, and we were going to basically auction it off. And we got to that point, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked at Random House, and she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book, and you need to turn it down when it comes in. And I asked her why, and she said, well, we're about to lay off a bunch of people, and the editor who wants your book is one of them. I got a similar phone call from somebody over at HarperCollins, and probably within 2 weeks, all these layoffs hit. Random House hit HarperCollins, and it was a really nasty time. And if you've ever known an author who's had a book with a traditional publisher and you lose your editor, that book can end up in limbo. Because there's nobody there to champion it, but you're stuck in a contract, so you can't do anything about it. So you may lose your release date; it may not come out at all. A lot of bad things can happen.
Yeah, that's really cool, and two, it sort of allows you to not have to play that game of trying to pitch it to publishers every time you write a book, which I'm sure is like, and at your level, I imagine it's exciting to sort of like see people like wanting it, but at the same time, it's probably just frustrating to have to deal with it every time. you know.
Yeah, I know a lot of people in this industry, and I had talked to, I think it was Dean Koontz years back, and he had told me that never sign more than like a 2 or 3 book deal. Like you don't want to be stuck with anybody, but that basically means you're more or less a free agent, and that's kind of how I was. So every book that came out, my agent had to take it out to everybody, had to shop it, and that's sometimes a couple weeks, it could be a couple of months, but it's a long, drawn out process. And I write pretty fast. I do 2 to 3 books a year. So I just didn't want to have to keep going through that, and for me, this deal that I've got with Simon & Schuster is just fantastic because I don't have to worry about any of that anymore.
It sounds like a lot of your success has really stemmed from you sort of like having that community sort of like built before you really like jumped in head first. How have you found like having contacts and networking and like having friends in the industry has benefited you like as you've moved through it?
I think it's extremely important. Ultimately, you're selling a product, you're selling a widget, and it doesn't matter whether you're selling hammers or you're selling bananas or you're selling books. A lot of it is going to come down to who you know and how they can work with you, how you can work with them. So I've always cultivated contacts. I've stayed in touch with people. Like I had mentioned, I worked in newspapers and magazines. Like some of those people are still friends with me today, and we still work together on some level. And sometimes years can go by, and I'll pick up the phone and call one of them, or they'll call one of me. But I've always tried to stay in touch with everybody. I try to help everybody that I possibly can, because you never know when you might need a favor down the road. And in a world like this, like every person that I've talked to, even some of the big name authors, we've all started with literally nothing. Like my email list had 0 people on it 10 years ago. And I write books with James Patterson now. His email list started with 0 people when he first started out. Like everybody builds. But I found that if you reach out to even people like that and ask them a question, like they will help you. They'll answer that question for you. They'll offer some guidance. It's the writing community is fantastic when it comes to that. Everybody helps each other out. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've succeeded. And I make a conscious effort to make sure that I continue to do it too.
Yeah, and I feel like it's important just to sort of like let anybody that's sort of like planning out books now to know, like, and it really doesn't matter what level you're at. Like all of us are authors, right? Like all of us are authors. All of us want to get to know other people, and we're all peers at the end of the day. So like, don't feel like you can't reach out to this person or that person, because like a lot of times they're gonna want to help you if you have a good, if what you're selling seems good, you know.
Yeah, they've all been there. I've got a podcast called Writers Inc., and we interview some of the biggest names authors out there, and we always get their origin story. And everybody's got the same story. Like they were working a job that they didn't like. They always liked to write. They wrote for fun when they were younger. They wrote for fun when they got older. Tried to turn it into something. Eventually they sold that first book. They got their first agent. Like everybody's story is very, very similar. So everybody's been there, done that. So there's no reason for you as somebody new, you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and I think that, like, you're right. Like a lot of people, most writers aren't taught or told that they could be writers from the get-go, so you have to have a more like reasonable path that you work, that then you just regret doing that from the entire time you're at that job.
Yeah, I mean, I went through the same thing. I mean, I'd been writing my entire life, from the time I was a little kid, all the way up through when I was adult, and my parents encouraged the creative side of it. They say, but it was a hobby, like you can keep doing this. We love that you're doing it, but you need to get a real job. You can't make a living as a writer. Like that was drilled into my head, which is the reason I went off to college and I got the corporate job, and I kind of fell into that same role that society kind of expects you to. I bought a house, had a mortgage, and before you know it, you're kind of trapped, which is why my wife and I had to take that extreme move. It's a catch 22, right? Because like I feel like I could have started writing in my 20s if I wanted to, when I had none of those entanglements. But I really learned how to write over those 20 some years when I was doing it as a side gig. So if I had started publishing books back in my 20s, I don't know that I'd be as successful today as I am now. So I wouldn't change anything, but I think it's very important that people follow their dreams. Like if you feel you want to do this, you need to get out there and do it, because those years they tick by pretty fast, and before you know it, you're sitting on a porch in a rocking chair wondering what if.
Yeah, I mean, here you talk about that 18-month period. Like, while I don't love the idea of having to live off of savings, it sounds like a dream to have 18 months to not have to work a day job. And also, right, like it is a thing. Like it is just very hard to try to make this work as like a thing you're doing on the side, whatever you don't feel that is on the side.
Well, I mean, even when I was in the corporate world, I wrote every day. I forced myself to do it, and not much, maybe 200 to 300 words, but that's a novel within a year. And I think anybody can do that. I was working 60 to 80 hours a week and still hammering that out. And I would write in the line at the grocery store if that's what it took, but I made sure I got those words every day. When I started writing full time, then it becomes a full time job. Today I started at 7 in the morning, which is the norm for me. I turn off the internet as soon as I sit down at my desk, because that just completely distracts me.
Yeah.
And I pounded out I think I got 2,400 words. I usually do 2 to 3,000 words a day. That's kind of my goal. Then about 10:30 or 11, I flip on the internet and my inbox just fills up with the business side of this. other authors that I'm working with, questions from my agent, interviews like this, all those kind of things kind of come into play. I wrap up my day at 3 o'clock every day. My quitting bell rings, and I go for a run. I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth in New England. And I do a lap around the island. And I kind of use that time to clear my head and think about what I need to work on the next day. And then the rest of the day goes to family. But it's a full time job, and you have to treat it that way.
Welcome back to Most Writers Fans. I'm joined again with JD Barker. We're talking about the idea of like thriller versus horror, because I feel like there's a lot of distinction between these different things, but also a lot of overlap. And also, just to be very clear, with anybody listening, a lot of times genre is more of like a thing. Like as authors, we know that you sort of write a book sometimes without even thinking about genre, and then you decide the genre after it's written, because it's more of like a marketing term, right? Of like where it's going to go on the shelf, basically. But as somebody who has written multiple, horror, suspense, and thriller books, how would you sort of define those genres? How do you look at them?
So very early on, I made a conscious decision. I love thrillers. I love horror. I knew I wanted to write both. So I bounced back and forth. My first novel was a horror novel. The second one was a thriller. Then I wrote a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family. So very firmly back in the horror camp. Then I wrote the second book in my thriller series. And I've consciously bounced back and forth between those two genres. On my Wikipedia page, if you read it, it says I'm a suspense author, which he may include elements of horror, elements of sci-fi, elements of this, elements of that. So I purposely defined myself as something in between. I was told early on to try to come up with a common thread if I'm going to bounce between genres, something to tie it all together. So for me, that's suspense. And the readers have come along for that. And I think it's primarily because I do bounce back and forth. To give you an example of somebody who didn't, James Patterson, I've gotten to know him really well, writing books with them. His very first book was called The Thomas Berriman Number, which nobody read. I don't even think he's got a copy of that one. His second one was Along Came a Spider, which was, a successful serial killer book. And it took off extremely well. And he wrote another one and another one and another one. He wrote 5, serial killer novels, and then he got tired of it and he wrote a book about a girl with wings. And his fans did not buy into that because it was just so different. They had been conditioned at that point to expect a particular type of book out of him. So I think as an author, you have to make a conscious decision, try to do it as early as possible of what you want to do, with your career. Try to think out 5 years, 10 years, and try to map it out and come up with something that works. If you can come up with a common thread, definitely do that. But at the same time, you have to be able to define who you are as an author, because if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it for you. The second an agent picks up your book and they need to tell an editor about it, they're going to tell you you are a blank. You are this type of author. That editor is going to turn around and tell his marketing people, this person is this type of author. Those people are going to tell the bookstores, this is what shelf that book, that author goes on, because they're this type of author. So like they like to put you in that box. They kind of have to in order to sell the books. But you can control that narrative.
Yeah. So when did that happen? Like when did you sort of like realize that? Did you early on talk about being a suspense author, or did you sort of like have to learn this as you went?
No, I knew before I wrote the first book that I was going to do this, and it came out of conversations only because I had seen it happen to so many people. And prior to that, I had worked in the music business, and I had friends that had a pop song that hit. They went into the top 5, top 10, and all of a sudden they had to write the same song over and over again. But
Yeah.
they didn't want to write that same song. They may want to dabble in country, not necessarily pop, but they got pigeonholed. So like the idea of that kind of scared me. What I have noticed over time, though, is as much as I like horror and I love writing it, my thrillers outsell the horror by exponentially. So I have to write thriller novels in order to support my hobby of writing the horror novels.
Do you make the decision of what genre to write when you start, or do you feel like it kind of like fills itself out as you go? Like how does that process work for you?
No, I'm going to continue bouncing back and forth, horror novel, thriller novel, back and forth like that. I look at the ideas, and I know basically from that idea which direction that book is going to lean. But I carry elements from both into there. So I may write a thriller, but it's going to have elements of horror in there. And vice versa. If I write a horror novel, like I wrote a prequel to Dracula that I mentioned, if you read that, it reads very much like a thriller. So I brought the thriller pacing into the horror genre. So I try to mix it up a little bit, and it helps me stand out.
Yeah. So So what have you been writing late? Like, what are you writing now? Like, not like the things that you don't have to get into it. You don't have to like reveal anything, but like just sort of like vague. Or is it like thriller now? Are you in a horror right now? Like, what do you?
It's kind of a little bit of both, and it's all over the press, so it's no secret. Secret. I'm writing a book to reboot the Flatliners
Oh yeah,
franchise. I
yeah.
don't know if you remember the movie Flatliners from the '90s. Yeah, so the guy who wrote it, his name's Peter Filardi, and he was on one of my other projects as a screenwriter. And we got to talking about this years ago, and I told him I had an idea to restart everything. And he got the rights back in January, and we touched base, and we decided to go ahead with it. So I'm about 70, 80,000 words through that novel, and it's fantastic. It kind of combines everything because it's got horror there, it's got suspense, it's got thriller. I'm kind of throwing it all in there, and a little bit of sci-fi too.
How has that been different for you? Like writing sort of like an established IP that you're rebooting versus writing something that's in from your head. Like, how has that sort of like?
There are a lot of attorneys involved. Because this is where it gets tricky. So Flatliners was a movie, but yeah, I'm only allowed to use the screenplay that it was based on. As the basis for this book, and there are a lot of differences between the original screenplay and the movie that actually made it to film. They made a lot of changes, so I have to be very careful. If I do something that appears in the movie but didn't appear in the original screenplay, that can actually get us in trouble. So there's basically a lot of people reading this as I go, pointing out what I can and can't do. I know it's going to get filmed, which changes things a little bit. You start thinking about locations and budgeting, as you're writing. So those kind of things come into play. So it's a little trickier. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, I guess, rather than just me, sitting down by myself making up a
Yeah, I mean,
story.
I'm sure you're probably familiar with working with a lot of those like parameters from your book doctor ghostwriter days because you were given an idea basically, right? In a lot of instances. But then like I'm sure this is very different though because like it's still like your story, right? Ultimately. Like what you're telling is still your story. It just has a basis in this other story.
Yeah, I mean, we basically just took the certain elements of the original Flatliners, the key pieces of that particular story, and we're bringing them into the 21st century, and something that's a completely different take on it. They tried to reboot it a few years ago, and if you watch the movie, it's good, but they basically rehashed the
Yeah.
original story with a new cast, and
I'm sure
that's
Hollywood
that's
would
not what
never
we're
do that.
doing.
That
We're
doesn't
we're
sound
doing
right.
something completely different. Hollywood is yeah, it drives me nuts. I mean, and I get it, like years back when I wasn't involved in that part of the industry, like it drove me nuts to see another Spider-Man movie coming out. But in today's world, I've got so many friends that work on that sort of thing. Like that's the bread and butter for the studios, and like they need those Marvel movies to hit so that they've got money in the bank account to do something different, to try a new project. So you kind of have to take the good with the bad.
Yeah. So you mentioned that your first actual book that you sold like had a movie deal attached to it. Like, what was that? Did you have to like? Were you involved in that at all, or did you just kind of have to like let it go and let the studios do what they do with it? Like, what was that like for you?
Oh, Hollywood is crazy. I've got 8 different books in what I call various stages of Hollywood hell. None of them have gotten optioned in the same way. They've all kind of come together differently. I'll give you an example. So, A Caller's Game, which I mentioned earlier, at that point, I had already had a couple books that I'd gotten optioned, and I kind of got a little cocky when I was writing this book. I was like, I'm going to write something that there's like no way that they can film just to see what happens. So I wrote the book. I blow up like half of New York, thinking there's no way anything's going to happen with this. Ridley Scott's company optioned the book. So it kind of happened like straight off the bat. And then it sat there for a little while. And that happens quite a bit with options. And I think he had it for maybe 6 months to a year. And then I got a phone call saying Jennifer Garner is interested. Jennifer Garner, we had some meetings with her. She had what's called a first look deal with Netflix, which brought Netflix in. So now we had a studio. Netflix had a tentative $100 million budget for the project. So that's roughly what they figured it would cost to film. So like all these pieces came together probably in about 2 or 3 weeks. Then a couple days later, I got another phone call. Jennifer Garner has to pull out because of a scheduling conflict. So that means our star is gone, our budget is gone, our studio is gone, and we're back to where we started. So it's this crazy roller coaster. So as an author, like, I I try not to get too involved in it because it will just totally distract me from writing the books, which is my true bread and butter. With Dracul, the prequel to Dracula, I mean, that was optioned by Paramount before we sold the publishing rights, with Andy Muschietti attached to direct, which we thought would be fantastic. And Andy's an incredible director. He did It for Stephen King, so we figured that was a home run. But what I learned later is, a lot of projects were optioned with Andy Muschietti attached. And whenever he finishes up a project, he basically looks at that list and he says, okay, I'm going to do this one. And if it's not your project sits there. And it basically means that nobody else can do it because it's tied to that particular director. So Paramount optioned that book over and over and over again. And it just sat on that list. And finally, we got the rights back and it went with somebody else with, didn't have so many constraints on it. So, sometimes what you see is you think is a blessing is actually a curse. And sometimes it's the other way around. At this point, I have yet to have any of my books actually put on film. Like, they've never actually made it over the finish line. But you can make a very good living just from those option payments. So I'm perfectly happy as long as those.
So as somebody who is a bit of a self-starter and likes to like have control, you mentioned you're kind of a control freak. Have you been tempted to sort of like try to produce an indie film on your own out of one of your works, or?
No, I mean, the closest I came is for that particular book, I wrote a screenplay for it. I was asked to do it. Like, it wasn't something I wanted to do, but I figured, okay, I'll give it a shot just to see what happens. My movie ended up being 4.5 hours long. And the reason being is, like, when I write the book, I mentioned how I kind of trim the fat off of steaks. So, like, by the time the book is finished, I feel like I've taken out anything that doesn't need to be in there. So when it came time to write the screenplay, there was nothing that I personally felt I could strip out. So my movie was 4.5 hours long. That it needs to go into the hands of somebody similar to what I was doing as a book doctor, somebody who's not attached to that project, who can, whittle away at it and get it down to an hour and a half. That being said, the funny thing is, like, in today's world, because so much stuff is streaming, we've had studios look at it and say, well, we could do a 2 or 3 parter. It's not a big deal. So now all of a sudden, it's not a feature film that's 4.5 hours long. It's a, 4, 5, 6 episode, limited series on somebody. So, everything works on some level.
As I was going to say, that sounds like a really good miniseries. And, like, that's a whole other route that would be.
Yeah, I love the streaming stuff, because, like, when Fourth Monkey, when we were talking to the studios about that and they were talking about the feature film, the first thing directors would tell me is everything they've got to take out. Like, this character's got to go, this storyline's got to go, we've got to get it down to an hour 45, hour 50 minutes. And you lose so much, like, you don't really have the same story anymore. And then I started having those same conversations about streaming series, when that really started to take off. And not only can they film the full book, but they would ask for additional material. Like, what did you take out? Like, what can we throw in here that nobody's seen or heard of yet? And I honestly, I prefer that. But I've got a mix of both right now, some series in the works and some feature films.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me, JD. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. If people would like to learn more about you, where should they go to do that? Where could they?
The easiest place to
you?
find
Where
me
can
is
they find your books, all those kind of
jdbarker.com.
things?
The books are pretty much everywhere. I've got a couple coming out. The one behind me, We Don't Talk About Emma, comes out in February. I've got another book with James Patterson called The Writer coming out in March. My next solo title is called Something I Keep Upstairs, and it comes out in May. And it's honestly probably the scariest book I've ever written.
Most Writers Are Fans is a Starlight King production. Special thanks to our guest, J.D. Barker. The audio and video for this episode of Most Writers Are Fans is edited by Andre Williamson. You can find video episodes of Most Writers Are Fans on YouTube and Spotify. If you'd like to support the podcast, please rate and review it. Also, please make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to send a message or record a voice message or leave a comment, please visit mostwritersareFans.com. You can also email us at press@starlightkingpress.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be afraid to tell your story.